Welcome to Learning PHP. These videos are going to be a guide for learning the basics of PHP. My aim is to help you build your skill set at industry level standards, and these tutorials will often go against the grain of a lot of other tutorials you'll see out there. My name is James and I've been a commercial PHP developer for the past decade. My personal experience actually dates back to the late 90s with PHP version 3, and I started learning PHP around the age of 11 or 12. But that's enough about me, so let's get into it. So the first thing you're probably going to ask is, what does PHP actually stand for? Now, previously there has been comments stating that PHP used to stand for personal homepage. More recently, it actually is a recursive acronym whereby the first letter actually stands for the acronym itself. So in PHP, it actually stands for PHP hyperprocessor, which is a bit strange, I know. So the PHP hyperprocessor and the PHP of that also stands for PHP hyperprocessor. So it's a bit of a joke within the open source world, recursive acronyms. Either way, it's not that important. And to be honest, most people aren't really that bothered to understand exactly what PHP stands for. So PHP is essentially a layer that will sit on top of a HTTP server, which will basically process, for instance, a file at runtime and give the HTTP server the output. So what you'll generally have is a source file, an interpreter, which will basically relay the process binary to the HTTP server, and then the HTTP server will pass that information onto the client. This will become a little bit more apparent as we go on, but for the basics of this, I'm going to keep it quite simple. I'm not really going to dive too much into that right now. So let's say you want to get up and going with PHP, and what I mean previously about going against the grain is a lot of tutorials will basically try and get you to use what's known as WAMP or MAMP or LAMP. So you're probably asking, what the hell are all these things? Well, WAMP is actually just Windows, Apache, PHP and MySQL. We're not going to dive into MySQL today, so I'm going to keep that out. We're just going to keep it simple to Windows, PHP and Apache. So, well, if you do Windows, Apache and PHP, we're creating WAP. But we're actually going to take it to a little bit of a further level than you'd actually use with a standard WAMP sort of setup. Now, there's some tools out there known as XAMPP, which will basically give you a nice little installer where you just run it, and then you can basically modify a PHP file on your local version of Windows. But I don't like doing that. Now, like I said, what I'm going to give you is industry level development. So typically, if you are running a PHP server locally, it might not be representative of the server that you're going to be deploying the code to. Say, for instance, you develop your application on a Windows environment, but you host the actual application on a Linux environment. You don't know the outcome of what your application will do, because you basically haven't replicated the environment you're going to be deploying it on. So what I plan to take you through today is a very simple overview of what is known as Docker, or more specifically containerization. And now what I mean by that is essentially running not virtual machines, but containers on top of a virtual machine, if that makes any sense to your sort of knowledge. Now, essentially you have your operating system, and on top of your operating system, you can run what's known as a virtualized environment. This virtualized environment can, for instance, be the same as your current operating system. It could be a Linux-based operating system, Mac, older version of Windows, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But basically what that does is detaches itself from your current operating system to allow it to run in a basically a contained environment, which could easily replicate a live environment or a production environment. So what I plan to take you through is a very basic overview of what's known as Docker. Now, this is very much an industry standard tool, and you'll probably find any big PHP development studio that you go to will probably be using, if not Docker, something else, maybe Vagrant or some other twist. But Docker is generally quite a big powerhouse. So let's just get going with Docker, and then I can explain as I kind of go along. So what you'll probably want to do first is is basically get Docker. Now I'm going to do this on Windows. I know you probably, if you're an experienced PHP developer, you probably call me a noob because I'm developing PHP on Windows. In my day-to-day life at work, I don't actually. I develop on Linux and Mac, and I very rarely touch Windows. So this is why Docker is a big thing for me. So for instance, because I'm working on a Windows environment at the moment, and let's just say I'm going to release to a Linux-based environment, I need something that can basically mock Linux for me. So that's where Docker comes in. So what we need to do first is download ourselves a copy of Docker. I can never remember where the link is. I think it's under Products and then Docker Desktop. So because I'm running Windows, simply just run download for Windows. This will basically just kick off a download. Actually, no, it won't. It will give me an option to download. And I think what you need is probably the stable edition. You could use the Edge channel, which I think is more of a sort of development environment for Docker. But we'll go with the Get Docker CE, which, if I'm correct, means Community Edition for Windows. So once that's started, basically I've already got Docker installed, so I won't take you through the entire installation process. Here's a tip: press Next until it's finished. That is pretty much the installation process. So I'm just going to cancel that because I don't really want to waste disk space on my local machine. Now once you actually have Docker installed, I'll bring this down to my desktop. Let's show my desktop. Okay, so as you can see here, there's not much going on, but I do have an icon called Docker for Windows. So double clicking that will probably do nothing, but it has actually done something. It's actually started your Docker environment, and what I mean by that is in the bottom right hand corner you will have a little Docker icon, and right clicking on that will give me some indication of if it's running or not, and in this case it is. And to be honest, that's pretty much all you need. All you need is to have that running. You don't need anything more than that. I'm going to reopen my window so I don't lose my place, and that is pretty much it for the Docker setup side of things. So you're not actually installing this big, application that's basically going to be running an Apache server, a PHP interpreter. To be fair, it doesn't actually run it, it's an interpreter, and a MySQL instance. We'll come to MySQL later in the sort of set of tutorials, but for now we just have a very basic Docker container environment set up. So how do we run a PHP server from this? Well, you can do it with what's known as either a Docker file, a Docker composer, or a Docker compose, sorry, or you can just simply run it the commands from the command line. But because this isn't really a Docker tutorial, I don't really want to get into that too much. And what I've done is I've already set this up for you. So in my project, and this is called Learning PHP 01. If you're curious, this is all going to be on GitHub, so if you check out the description box down below, you will find a link to all the source code that I will have in all of my tutorials in my GitHub repository. If you've been following my Learning Solidity tutorials, you'll know that I always update my repository with every single video, so the source code is always readily available. So I have my Learning PHP. Now, if you're curious about my IDE, I'm using what's known as Atom. It's a free IDE. Feel free to download it. It's a great little tool. There's plenty of IDEs out there. You don't need to specifically use Atom. It's just what I use. Also, please leave a comment if my text is not big enough. This is a 4K screen, and I've tried to zoom in as much as I can without losing too much off the edges of the screen. So what I'm going to start with is the Docker file itself. Now, all I'm stating from this Docker file is that I'm going to be creating a Docker, I think it's a Docker image of something else. Now, this is actually itself a Docker image. So I'm creating a Docker image locally of my Docker image. It's a bit of a contradiction, really. Well, it's not really a contradiction. It's a bit more of a confusing concept. But to be honest, just go with it, because later on I'll probably be updating this Docker file with other configuration values, such as like copying my PHP INI to the Docker version of it, or Apache rules or so forth. But for now, we'll just go with a very basic Docker. I wanted to keep this as simple as possible. So what I'm stating in my Docker file is that I want to create a Docker image of a pre-existing Docker image called PHP 7.2-Apache, which is basically a little bundle of PHP and Apache 2. And that's basically it. It's a very simple Docker container. So the next thing I need to do is create what's known as a Docker Compose. Now in theory I could simply spin this Docker container up, but I would need to do some copying of files to, I need to do some copying of files from my local drive to the Docker container. But that's a bit of a mess. So what I need to do instead is attach a volume. Now I know at the moment I'm throwing out concepts like container, volume and so forth. These things will become more apparent as tutorials go on, and just to give you a basic concept of volume, volume simply means I want to attach a local directory on my current computer. So for instance, in this case, what I'm stating is I'm attaching /source, so that's what I'm attaching, which is actually just this folder here, so source within learning PHP-1, and I want to map that to var www HTML, which is the default directory of Apache. So if I visited this server in my browser, this is basically the folder which will be serving my files. So for instance, if you have an understanding of HTML and CSS and so forth, you'll know that a server basically has a root access point, which is going to be this directory of var www HTML. You can probably go ahead and ignore the fact that we're using the default network. I just wanted to run it on localhost rather than do any fancy networking or Kubernetes, something or other, which will probably just confuse the living hell out of you if you do not know anything about containers. All I'm saying is map port 80 to 80. I'm just using it as a pass-through. I don't currently have anything running on port 80 on my local machine. If you do, you can change which port you want to expose. So for instance, I'm running Apache on port 80. If I want to do, if that conflicted with a local instance, I could simply change that to map from 80 to 80, I don't know, 8080, which will then mean I can access it through a different port. But again, we're going to keep things simple for this tutorial, and we're going to be mapping straight to port 80. What I'm doing here is also I'm stating build my Docker file. That's it. That's all it's basically doing. I could obviously here state something like just build from an existing image, but I want to build from my Docker file. Again, it's just something that I do personally. I always tend to build from a local Docker file or a specific Docker file when I'm spinning up a Docker container. So that's our Docker file, and that's our Docker file, and that's our Docker Composer. That's all we need. Now to start this, we can do this with one simple command. So if you're in Windows, spin up a PowerShell. If you're in Mac, spin up a terminal, Linux terminal, and then simply just navigate your way to the root of this directory, which obviously is a learning PHP-01 directory, and then simply run docker compose up. If I can spell up right. Now basically what this is going to do, it's going to take your Docker Compose file, run through it, find out all it needs to do. It needs to run on port 80, it needs to map port 80 to port 80. It needs to mount the volume src to var www HTML. It's using a default network, and it needs to build the Docker container that you've defined within your Docker file from the pre-existing image PHP 7.2-Apache. Okay, so that's it. So what does that mean? What have we actually just done? We've actually just created a HTTP server that has a PHP interpreter attached to it, that if I, for instance, were to kick up a browser and go to localhost, I'm getting a hello world. Now this is actually being served from my Docker container. So let's have a look at what this hello world is. Now hello world is always your basic go-to. I'm creating a very simple application without any bells and whistles and so forth. Now let's just dive a little bit into PHP. Now we've covered the basics of the environment. PHP to work within basically to be interpreted has to have these tag constraints. And what I mean by that is when you're doing HTML, for instance, you always have this concept of tags. So you'd have like a HTML, with inside HTML you'd have a body or title or so forth, or a head. PHP works in a very similar way, where it needs to start with less than question mark PHP. So that is your opening tag. You probably noticed that I don't have a closing tag. If you have a file that is exclusively PHP and nothing else, the standard is not to do that. That's a closing PHP tag, which is question mark greater than. But because this file contains PHP and only PHP, it's actually bad practice to have that, because there is a white space every time you do that. A white space is basically created after it. It's like an end of a line process. So now we have our open PHP tag, where we've instantiated, we've basically told the interpreter, this is PHP, you need to process this. We're now sending it some very basic commands. You've probably heard potentially of this command echo before, which isn't derived from PHP. As far as my knowledge goes back, I think it comes from shell. It could come back even further than shell. But basically what it's doing is saying, I want to input something to the output stream. Now, when the PHP interpreter comes along, it basically goes, oh, echo, right, I need to write something to the output stream that I'm going to be sending to the HTTP server. So if you remember rightly before, you had the source file, which is what this is here. You then, under the source file, would have the PHP interpreter. So the file is getting picked up by the interpreter. Then it is basically processing the file. It's identifying that we've called the command echo, which is basically telling the interpreter, I need to basically pass something to the HTTP server. So in this case, it's going to be hello world. It's going to take that content or that string, pass it to the HTTP server. The HTTP server is then going to serve that to the browser. So let's see that in action. As you saw before, let's just make that window a little bit smaller and bring it over here and zoom in. So as you can see, we have a very basic hello world. Now, what can we change with that? Well, we can actually change a few things. It could be hello world or hello James. Now, if I say that is hello James, if I refresh the page, it's updated hello James. It doesn't just have to be echo. It can be other things as well. There's actually a number of ways to output to the output buffer or the output stream of the PHP interpreter. So that could either be print. So started a new output stream. It could also be printf. Another way to output. In fact, because that's a function call, it needs to be within brackets. So the differences that you'd have here is that echo and print are instructions. They're telling the interpreter to do these things. Printf is actually a function. So you basically, the F on the end doesn't actually mean function, it actually means format. But it's actually a function, so it itself probably in turn will call something like print or echo or so forth. But if I actually refresh the browser, we have various different ways of outputting to the output stream. So let's just tidy that up a bit, because we're going to stick with echo. Echo is what I like to use. It's the most standardized way, and it very much reflects PHP. Now, I'm actually going to stop the tutorial there, because that is just getting to grips with the basics of outputting something to a browser. We've not touched on variables, I've not touched on strings, I've not touched on data types or any of that yet. I just wanted to get going with a very simple getting you to output something to a browser like this with a nice standardized environment. So you've got a simple three file structure. You've got a Docker container here that you can spin up, and if you want to turn it off, you have to hit Control-C, which basically detaches you from the process. Docker container is still actually running at this point, so if I refresh this, I'm still hitting the Apache. Actually, no, it isn't. I've killed it for some reason. I think it's because I hit Control-C. I used to detach it. Now, basically the Docker container is actually still there, so if I do docker compose ps, you'll still be able to see the Docker container here, which is this one. So learning PHP-01 www1, which is basically our Docker container. If I wanted to remove that, I can simply do, I think it's docker compose. Oh, this is a kill, I think. Removes all containers. Nope. Let's just check the command list. So if I do, it's rm, compose rm. So you've got this command here, rm, remove stop containers. So it should see going to remove learning PHP -01 www. Yes, I want to get rid of it. So I did docker compose ps, which I think used to mean process list, but it's just list containers. But either way, there we go. Our container is now gone. If you want it back, just run docker compose up, and it will return, and then you can carry on editing your PHP at your heart's content. Now, in the next tutorial, I'm going to be looking at data types. Don't hold me to that. I've often been known to change my mind about these things, but either way, that has been the first tutorial in learning PHP. I hope you found this useful and inciting. If I was gibbering on enough or too much, please leave a comment down below. I do appreciate every bit of feedback that I get, and I use the feedback to basically improve my tutorials. So if you like the quality of my tutorials, feel free to leave a comment, because it just helps me improve the quality overall. And also don't forget, leave a thumbs up if you like it. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Either way, that is the end of the tutorial today. I hope you found this useful, and I'm hoping to catch you next time.